Hello, everybody. This is Jennifer Schaus coming to you live from Washington, D.C., and thanks for joining us in our Federal Government Webinar Wednesday series. We've been hosting webinars every Wednesday for the last few years, covering a variety of topics on government contracting, and today we are talking about cybersecurity. Our webinars are, as I mentioned, every Wednesday. They're complimentary and they are recorded. So if you need to log off today for any reason or you're not able to make the 12:30 session, you can check back on our website. You can go to our YouTube channel, and we will also email everyone the recordings. We don't take questions simply because we're trying to keep these short and sweet and to the point and educational. So if you do have questions for our speaker, Brian Smith is our speaker today. His contact information will be on the last slide. You'll have his phone number and email address, and you can contact him directly. A little bit about us before we get started. Jennifer Schaus & Associates is a small business, and we help companies that sell to the federal government. We work with product companies, service companies, software companies, domestic and foreign, large businesses, and small businesses, and our services are listed here on this slide. To let everybody know, we do have two events coming up. One is October 24th. It's a teaming and partnering class that's going to be held over in Maryland. And then in December, we have our annual conference, which is doing business with DoD and the Intel community. That's held in Northern Virginia and Arlington at the George Mason University campus. There are advertising and sponsorship opportunities, about 300 government contractors expected. You can also advertise in our newsletter, which reaches close to 16,000 government contractor subscribers. To get pricing information, you can email the email address there on your screen. Brian Smith is our speaker today. A little bit about him and his background is on this slide, and we will jump into his topic, which is cyber liability, GovCon asset protection. So Brian, thanks so much for joining us today. I'll hand the floor over to you now.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to join in and be part of this wonderful program where we try to talk about things that can help government contractors, especially from a compliance perspective, but most notably if we find a deficiency on a routine basis or a level of awareness that needs to be increased, cyber is certainly one of them. So I'm really glad to be part of today's discussion. So why don't we go ahead and get started by going right into the program. And we titled this today, Cyber Compliance and Liability Protection of GovCon Fortress, because historically, I think people have been inundated with cyber requirements on the federal side. And we have been putting on sessions, and I've been meeting with people, and over and over and over again, we continually hear how much stuff is coming through the system with regards to cyber protection. But very little has been brought up about what the exposures are to the company. So let's go ahead and get started with that by going to the next slide. And what we want to cover today is we're going to cover the fact that cyber is certainly more than compliance. I mean, it's something where companies feel that they haven't been able to keep up with things, but at the same time, they're required to meet these deadlines that are in place by organizations. And then at the same time, who's checking up on it and who's verifying it? And so there are a variety of catches there with bids and proposals and so forth. But cyber is way more than compliance. And it's about protecting the data is, again, only one component of risk management. But what's really important from the perspective of insurance and liability is what's not being protected or what's not covered. And a lot of times what I find is that companies simply don't have a cyber liability program. And the importance of that, they think, well, we don't have the type of data that's required from this. We don't have that need. We don't need a cyber program because compliance is what's most important to us. But we're going to talk today about where those exposures are and why you may want to consider those or talk to others about their program in case you're doing consulting and areas that you can potentially help your client with. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. We want to cover today 5 components of the competencies of cyber risk, and we want to cover just a very little bit about NIST. I think everybody's pretty tired of NIST. about the non-public records exposures, and then what type of losses can be insured by a cyber liability program. And I'll tell you, for all intents and purposes, cyber liability protection is relatively inexpensive, especially if you do not have a lot of records. And we'll cover that in more detail as we move forward. So these are the elements that we're going to cover today, and let's go ahead and continue on. From the competency perspective, there are a lot of things that can be considered when it comes to the way you're protecting the data assets. And a lot of it has to do with what type of level of understanding not only do your supervisors and leadership have about cyber, but is that getting translated down to the rank and file? Are the people that are actually utilizing the devices, which include cell phones, it could include phone systems, pass cards, and even information that is in paper format that can be scanned or that can be stolen and then digitized and then used against the company. So those are some of the facets, and having a keen employee awareness program on what those exposures are or where those risks rest, I think is one of the most important aspects of any cyber protection program. Let's just call it a protection program. And that can be done in a variety of ways. You can talk with a different type of vendor about tests or quizzes, things that can be announced routinely, something that can be even promoted by your HR in conjunction with your IT department. And then the other one, of course, is the next step, is going to be the control of this access of sensitive information. Who has it? Who's actually responsible for it? And how far down the chain does it go in your organization where any information can be released? And that's where the crux is. I think people believe that in many cases that they simply don't have any sort of exposure because they don't handle data. But at the same time, they are controlling those devices. The third part of competency is actually testing your systems. We do, or we have recommended, and I'm talking about we, meaning risk management professionals, that you do almost like a tabletop exercise. What happens if this occurs? And in that case, you would work in conjunction with your senior leadership, and then you would have your IT staff in there, and then you would also have your compliance team, because that's the other thing that needs to be taken care of, because if a release occurs or a breach occurs, what steps are taken by whom and how quickly by the people at that table, and have you practiced it? Because when it does happen, like any loss or any incident, if you haven't practiced it, it's the first time you're doing it, and that's where mistakes are made. The next part of that would be the risk and security of accessing of risk and security. Where is it? How do you go through the system? I've got companies that I'm affiliated with where the systems are all contained within a government facility. There are no external access points to the systems that they work within because it's all handled under one roof. Now, if you have people that have devices, laptop computers, access cards, USB, you got a jump drive, anything like that, those are the types of risks that we want to take a look at and then have your people understand what could happen if they were to get out. And that's where it goes back to the awareness. And then finally, the integrity of the communication. How are things being handled internally? When you have people that are getting emails and there are issues with them possibly where they may send them forward, if there are aspects to it where they're not sure if something's real, because we could talk about phishing and a variety of other things there, but what actually happens? And those are the kind of things where as we move forward, how do you handle actually if you have communication issues within the organization that have not been considered yet? Next. I did mention before that, let's take a look here. Just want to make sure that we just hit a button. Hold on, I'm sorry about this. Next thing we have are the three facets of There we go. We have a variety of aspects when it comes to NIST 800, 53, and 171. I'm not going to get into that because I'm not a NIST specialist. But what I can tell you is that being NIST compliant is very important, not only from the perspective of being contractually compliant with what your requirements are, but it really is important from a local security perspective on what the government is looking for. And it has been received in mixed ways. For one, it's a pretty extensive program. Two, it's not inexpensive to implement if you use a third-party group, which many of you or many of your clients may have already had to do. We're already past the period now that it needed to be complied with. So in this case, the unclassified sensitive information or unclassified information needs to be considered protected at this point. So we really don't need to go on too much further with that. But what it really gets down to is the baseline minimum requirements of sensitive data protection. Okay, next. So a lot of, in many cases, I find people that say we just don't have access, we don't have any sort of exposure to this kind of thing. We're not worried if our data is breached because we don't really have anything of value, and we don't actually even have any online systems or anything in hardware like in any servers and whatnot. It's in the cloud. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But these are the things here on this slide: the employee information, the data about the company. This is where the rubber meets the road on the exposures of an organization when they think they don't actually have exposures, but these are some of the things that we do have. So in this case, let's just talk a little bit about the forensic cost and data restoration. What that means is this: if a breach does occur, and even if you don't have a lot of data, or you do have some data, but they tie it up, it's going to cost thousands of dollars just to find out what was actually missing. So that data, those forensic costs, they're actually detectives, cyber detectives that are going in there, and they're trying to piece together the things that could have been part of the breach. And those loss costs, or those those damages, if you will, have to come out the bottom line of the organization. And that's why it's important to consider having a cyber liability program that will handle the costs associated with digging up that information. The other part of that is, if you don't do that correctly and that data stays out there, then that certainly can jeopardize your contract, your contractual compliance. And that's a significant problem. But it goes even deeper than that, and I wanted to cover that here as well. The things that are also exposed for companies that say they really don't have any issues happens to be this disposal of data. How do you get rid of the stuff that you no longer have? If you delete something, is it deleted? Well, the short answer is no. It's somewhere. There has to be, and even your paper files. If you're using a third-party destroyer of documents, that's great. But you want to make sure that you have coverage in the event they don't have coverage. If you have a local company doing it for you, and I'm not going to bring up a national organization that does it, but there's a large one out there, and there's been problems with them where their information has been released. People found the paper files, and they actually were able to utilize that data. That's where a cyber liability policy would be your backstop against financial loss should that occur. Without going through each one of these in great detail, I do want to cover the last one, and that's rogue employees. This is something where no matter what you do from a risk management perspective, the exposures are there because you cannot, as a management team, control the actions of every single employee. It just doesn't happen. But it does get back to the communication aspect. It does get back to the employee education. And you can also have it where your IT systems or your professionals are well aware of what's happening within your system. But with those rogue employees, if you find something that does occur, that they released information, and we've had cases like this that have been in the press, if that occurs, how is your company being protected against those losses? Next step. Next slide. So one of the things that I bring up the most happens to be about ransomware. Ransomware is an element that they say, look, you're going to get an email and your screens go blank. You are going to lose your data if you don't pay us this amount of money in Bitcoin or some other cyber currency. When that happens, your company is basically at the mercy of the hacker. And those are some of the important aspects where no matter how good your security protocols are, if it does occur, you have a significant business loss, financial business loss. And that's where a cyber liability program would come into play. So anyone that you're working with, if you currently have a cyber liability program, you're likely going to have ransomware in as a coverage point. But one thing I do want to bring up to you is this. Make sure that you have a full limit on that, not a sublimit. In other words, if you're buying $1 million worth of coverage, if you look at your form, your policy, it may say you have a sublimit for ransomware rather, for $250,000. You want full limit on that because the occurrences are really increasing right now. Other aspects that we have found is that there are things called social engineering where they're impersonating one of your suppliers or their vendors, or they're phishing for information through your email system, and they're looking for ways to pull money out of your company. Specifically spear phishing, where they target an individual, and they're looking at that and they're trying to get information from your company so that they will put money from a wire wrongfully to another company and steal that money from your coffers. When that does occur, the problem with that is because if it was willful delivery, if you will, then you're not covered under your regular policy, but cyber would cover that. Next slide. 50% of companies, believe it or not, do not even have cyber liability insurance. I'm going to go on and say it's probably a little bit less than that. I would say likely 40%. I think the awareness has been going up a lot, especially in the last 24 months with the press covering this stuff. But what's really interesting about this, and I'm just going to throw this out to you, that 61% of U.S. firms expect to actually have an incident. So it's interesting to me that the companies that say, hey, we probably will, some of them may not even be covered. And the gap could simply be the communication about what it is, not being afraid of or understanding what the costs could be, and just having another data point in their system to make sure that they are properly protected. Next slide. When you do have this type of exposure, it can bring your business right to a halt. I mean, it could stop everything because all your screens can go black. Then you're waiting on them to get back with you with the instructions, or you have to go ahead and provide the cyber currency and so forth. So that's critical that you have some semblance of protection. When we talked earlier about the forensics, part of that is the discovery of what's going on here too. That's going to be part of the program where you're going to have a team of IT professionals working on your behalf to get you back up and running. But at the same time, your insurance company would be able to provide that ransom in the event it was required. There's also a huge amount of coverage out there that's being made available on the marketplace. And then when you do actually have, either you have a current policy or you're looking at a policy, you don't want it to have like a restricted date. So you want to do something what we call full prior acts. What that does is it basically picks up any exposure you've had really all the way back to when you started your company. And it's not difficult to get. You just have to ask for it. So be a savvy buyer and say, hey, we're looking for full prior acts coverage on our insurance for cyber liability. And you'll either surprise somebody or they're going to nod and go, okay, we get that for you. And again, let's go back to the other thing that I made mention of before with the sublimits on ransomware, for instance. Take a look at your policy or talk to your clients about their policies and find out, hey, what sublimits do we have in place? Because the client may be under the impression that they got $1 million or $2 million or $5 million, whatever, worth of coverage without looking at the sublimits. Very important that you cover that. Really what this protects against is defense against regulatory issues or penalties, if it's included in the policy. In some cases, you can have the policy endorse, the insurance policy, the cyber policy, to actually defend against you or provide defense for regulatory issues and penalties. It just needs to be added into your program. Again, rogue employees, you want that included, not excluded. And in some cases, Insurance policies may require you to have everything encrypted. If you don't have it, then you're going to have a gap in coverage. And finally, goes back to one of the original things that I made mention of, was the forensic recovery. Very critical that you have that too. Next slide, please. In conclusion, what I believe is most important about this webinar or anything we talk about with regards to cyber liability is the first point, and that is awareness. If you know more about where your exposures are and where your company may have a loss, all the better for you. All the better for your client if you happen to have clients that are in this space. Because every company out there has a cyber liability exposure. Whether or not they believe it, but if they have a computer, they are part of a network, even part of the cloud, because the cloud has limited amounts of insurance. And you got to look at the contracts for that. There is an exposure. The next thing is hire an expert. That expert could be an IT professional. It could be a company that specifically works with cybersecurity. You can even work with a law office, a law firm that specializes in this type of area. But most importantly, if you're a government contractor, you want to make sure you're compliant. And that's where that third-party expertise can really come into play. You also want to take a look at the program, the insurance program that you have on cyber liability. But I'm going to even broaden it out even further, and I'm going to say this. Any insurance policy you have, go to the exclusions. Take a look and see what's not being covered. What's not being covered. That's more important than what is being covered. And you need to have an explanation of what you bought. The insurance policy is a book or a document. It's very expensive, and nobody ever reads it until there's a claim. So you need to understand exactly what program you have. So you need to demand an explanation from your insurance professional, risk professional, or cyber professional on exactly what did your company purchase and what will it protect against. And finally, providing an annual review. Look for changes, operational shifts. What impacts could those changes have to the policy that you bought last year or even 3 years ago if it was on an automatic renewal? Keep up with the changes by keeping up with your internal audit system that's saying, hey, where are we at today versus where we were in 2016? Next slide. And with that,
Great.
I turn it back over to Jennifer.
Oh, sorry to cut you off. Great information, Brian. Lots of valuable content in there. If anybody has questions about any of the cyber insurance, obviously you can contact Brian. His email is listed here as well as his phone number. And in about 8 minutes, we've got another presentation coming up from Brian on cybersecurity on the liability side. So I hope everybody will join us for that. And today's session has been recorded. We'll get that up to the audience later today or tomorrow morning. And thanks again for joining us. Thanks, Brian, for a great presentation.
You're welcome. My pleasure.